Can 7/7 flat 9 sharp 9 resolve to 1 major 7? Okay, let's break this down, because even though this looks complicated, the chords when they are played next to one another actually don't sound that complicated. And what this actually reminds me of is how Oscar Peterson reharmonizes the jazz standard Misty. Check this out. It's such a hazy chord, like it's shrouded in a veil. It is a misty chord. I love this reharmonization.
Play Misty for me.
What's going on is he's playing a D major triad on top of an E flat in the bass. Normally the first chord on Misty is just a regular E flat major 7, the 1 chord, the home. But he sneaks in this reharmonization, this D chord. Now, if you're thinking about it in relationship to the 7/7 flat 9 sharp 9, this D triad on top of the E flat in the bass is the 7 in the key of E flat. If we were to play that 7 major chord and then add the dominant 7th to make it a 7/7, and then add the sharp 9 to make it a 7 sharp 9, that E flat in the bass would be the flat 9 of this 7/7 flat 9 sharp 9. Now in context, this chord sounds absolutely beautiful to me. It also kind of reminds me of a 1 diminished chord, a diminished 7th chord built on the root, resolving to a 1 chord. Both, I think, are acceptable ways of thinking about it, but to answer the question, yes, it can resolve to the 1 major 7. It sounds really nice. Are tuplets and polyrhythms just gimmicks? Well, if you've been watching my channel for the past couple years, you might get that impression from ridiculous things like this 7/11 polyrhythm challenge, but no. Tuplets and polyrhythms are not just gimmicks. They, in fact, form an integral part of many styles of music from across the world. You'll find all kinds of polyrhythms like 3/2 and 3/4. In Western art music, for example, you have things like Chopin's Fantasy Impromptu, which has a very rich 3/4 texture. A very different, but also equally as exciting and musically rich polyrhythmic effect can be found in Afro-Cuban music, like the music of the elite congueros, like Pedrito Martinez, for example. Another very different use of polyrhythm, but also one that is extremely necessary for the musical expression, can be found in the music of Meshuggah, like, of course, the insane polyrhythmic double kick of Bleed. For me, multiple strains of musical rhythms occurring at the same time and in relationship to one another creates this inherent push and pull tension that is just so invigorating. It's like kind of at the essence of what the music is just all about in the first place. So no, I don't think that polyrhythms are gimmicks at all. If we can have more than 12 notes, can we have less than 12? Sure, I've heard that called macrotonal music as opposed to microtonal music. If you have a VST like piano tech, you can basically just type in whatever division of the octave you'd like. So instead of 12 tones per octave, we could have like 5 tones per octave, and that would retune my piano to give us this kind of strange pentatonic sounding scale. Sounds pretty cool to me. It's like a pentatonic scale that's neither minor or major. You can also retune the piano to divide the octave into 7 evenly spaced notes. So it gives you this kind of scale which kind of sounds like the major scale, but not really. Apparently, some people think that traditional Thai music might relate in some way to the 7-tone equal temperament, but I think it's possible and very cool to have macrotonal music. Maybe experiment with it. I don't know. Opinions on clowncore. They are absolutely disgusting. Why is a quintuplet swing accented on 1 in 4 and not 1 in 5? Ask asking for a friend. Well, one way of thinking of this is thinking in terms of what's called swing percentages, which is a term that's adopted from a workflow from old school MPC machines. If you have regular evenly spaced eighth notes, you would say that there is a 50% swing because the first of the two eighth notes takes up 50% of the beat. It is 50% swing.
That's 50%.
If you have kind of a generic triplet swing, you would say that there is a 66% swing applied to the rhythm because the first of the two eighth notes in this triplet swing takes up 66% of the beat in terms of time elapsed. The first eighth note takes up significantly more time than the second eighth note.
If you have like a 66% swing percentage, it's like...
If you had what we would typically call quintuplet swing, where the first of the eighth notes takes the span of 3 quintuplets as opposed to the second of the eighth notes 2 quintuplets, we say that that has a 60% swing. So it takes up 60% of the beat. Now, there are many other gradations of swing with the swing percentage that you could think about. For example, the thing that you're talking about, where there's the accent on the first quintuplet and then the fifth quintuplet, you would think of as 80% swing. The first eighth note takes up 80% of the beat when compared to the second eighth note in an eighth note swing pattern. It has a very kind of choppy feel to it. I think the term that some drummers use is that it's overswung.
And then you can get like 80%. And like that steepness of swing is like super crazy. And you can experiment with how you want the groove to feel by messing with that, you know?
You could get kind of weird with it. For example, if you divided the beat into a group of 8 30-second notes and the first eighth note took the span of 5 of those 30-second notes and the second eighth note took the span of 3 of those 30-second notes, you'd have a 62.5% swing, which is kind of nice. It's like almost a triplet swing, but it's not quite as stilted as like the quintuplet swing of the 3 against 2. It's like its own thing entirely. Anyway, that's just another way of thinking about it. It's fun when you start experimenting with different swing percentages because each one of them has a very different feeling. Why are many non-classical musicians unwilling to learn to read sheet music? Well, my first impulse is to ask the smarmy response, which is, why are many classical musicians unwilling to learn how to improvise? There are many classical musicians that I've played with that just simply will not be able to play a note unless there is a piece of sheet music in front of them. They don't know how to connect with their instrument and improvise music from their own head and from their own hands. Now, I don't want to cast too much shade here, but the reason is because improvisation just is not required of many classical musicians, at least in the classical music scene. It's the same reason why non-classical musicians might simply not know how to read or have no interest in learning how to read. Yes, I use Western notation all the time in my videos as kind of like a visual aid, but for many styles of music, especially as you go further and further from the Western European tradition, it's just not necessary to know how to read.
Play Misty for me.
The tune Misty, that jazz standard that we were talking about earlier, was composed by a guy by the name of Errol Garner. And he very famously did not know how to read sheet music. Like, he would not be able to read his own tune out of the real book. And when he was criticized for this, he, possibly apocryphally, responded, "Nobody comes to watch me read." And I think that's a very important thing to emphasize. When you take this view that reading sheet music is necessary for the craft and creation of music, you have a very limited view, one that is very much beholden to the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians. Are lick memes still funny? Definitely not, and they never were. But that doesn't stop me from using them. 7-tone equal tempered lick. Opinion on nail polish while playing. There's a video that I did, 7 years ago with Jay Soto called I Didn't Know, where right before going into the recording session, I painted my nails golden. And I think they look quite good, if I do say so myself. I'm new to the idea of tuplets. Why not change time sig? Example, 5/8 instead of writing tuplet. Well, it really comes down to convention because what you're doing is you're dividing a unit of time into 5 evenly spaced groupings. And so for me, 5/8 means slower than quintuplets, but conceptually they're kind of the same. Rule of thumb that I use is that if you cannot physically get the words out of your mouth in the allotted time, then it's probably a tuplet. And if you can count out fast enough, then you can think of it as a time signature. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It could be 5, 8, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, probably quintuplets. How much of your furniture is from Ikea and why is it all of it? I resent the question. But yeah, that's from Ikea. Usual bass processing plugins and outboard gear. What's your typical signal chain on the bass? So I mainly use this bad boy, the Line 6 HX Stomp, for most of my stuff these days. The advantage here is I like having the hardware, but controlling it with the computer. So I have the patches on my computer, but as you see here, when I scroll through them and double click them on the computer, they change here on the actual unit, which is useful when performing live, because in the case of laptop failure, which does happen, I've been the victim of that many times, you'll still always have the hardware unit going. I like this thing, I use it for amp emulation. All the technical failures, sweet. Now the amp that I generally use with it is the Ampeg SVT4 Pro. I have this impulse response for an Ampeg, whatever that is.
Play Misty for me.
What's the biggest reasonable time signature? Like 21/8, 23/16, etc. Well, it really kind of just depends on like the culture that you're coming from, honestly, because that does affect your idea of what reasonable is. But for my money, 21/8 is actually fairly straightforward, because you can think of it like just two measures of 12/8, which is a regular time signature. It's a compound 4/4 made up of 4 beats of 3 subdivisions apiece. But then in the second measure of 12/8, you remove one of those beats. So it's like 12/8 plus 9/8, kind of like a compound 7/4. Because of that, it's actually relatively straightforward to rework some tunes in 12/8 into 21/8. So this is what Stevie Wonder's Isn't She Lovely would sound like in 21/8, I guess. Wild, like deleting that beat at the end of the phrase, but that's what it would sound like in 21/8, in case you wanted to know. There we go. Is Giant Steps really all that crazy? I mean, there are plenty of harder pieces of music than Giant Steps, but you have to think about it in context. The way I like to think about it is it's the jazz version of Niccolo Paganini's 24 Caprices. These are a series of compositions composed by the Italian virtuoso violinist Niccolo Paganini that were originally written to be so difficult that he was the only person in the world who would be able to perform them. Nobody else but he could perform the Caprices, because he allegedly sold his soul to the devil for his mad violin skills. The Caprices had this kind of like legendary status in terms of their technical difficulty, but nowadays there are many violinists who can play them, even though they present many, many technical challenges. And it's kind of the same thing with John Coltrane's Giant Steps. It's not the hardest piece in the world to play, but it is very difficult. It kind of sets the standard for improvisation, because if you can play it convincingly, which I can't, Lord knows, then that tells people that, hey, this person has practiced jazz. Congratulations. Traditionally, few other pieces in the jazz canon have that ability to communicate that information as directly and succinctly to other jazz musicians as whether or not you can play Giant Steps. And so because of that, traditionally, there is kind of this machismo around Giant Steps. You're kind of a dick if you call Giant Steps at a jam session because you're trying to like prove something. But, you know, it is a very, very good meme, and I very much appreciate all the Giant Steps memes that are on the internet. So if you make Giant Steps memes, thank you, everybody. Thank you for the Giant Steps. Super fast instant Q&A.